Shalom. The title of this week's Drash might be, Is Anyone Minding the Store? Are you feeling some level of uncertainty? Perhaps you are wondering if anyone is minding the store. I anticipate that many of us have those feelings many times in our life. Perhaps the current times are highlighting that a bit more for more of us. I think that the Aliyah that we look at this week, in this week's Parsha, has some insights for us. In Exodus 12, verses 40 and 41, it records, Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. There are three items that I would like to mention, and then we'll look into them. First is the reference to 430 years. That seems to be kind of like an odd number. Not like odd and even, but just like, why 430? Is there anything about? Is there something that the 430 means to us? Second, the phrase, to the very day, Vayehi be'etzem hayom hazeh. Why did the Exodus occur on exactly this day? And third, who was it that left Egypt? Now, we think it was the sons of Israel. Actually, according to the verse we just read, it was the Kol Tzevaot Adonai, the hosts of Adonai. So, who were these hosts of Adonai? And if you notice, why is it plural? Before we continue, let's pray. Again, Avinu our Father, we are grateful for the day that you give us. We are grateful, Father, for the many gifts, the many good gifts that you have given to your people, how you have blessed them and provided for them, how you have watched over them, and that you have led us to this time. We would ask, Father, that as we come before you, that you would open our eyes, that we would see and hear and know and understand, that you would give us ears to hear and a heart to understand, that we might follow after you. We ask, Father, in Yeshua's name. Amen. So, to begin, the 430 years. So, observations. In the scriptures, there are 4 references to a period of 430 years. The first is the years that Eber lived after fathering Peleg. Now, if you will tolerate this for just a moment, and let me play with this a bit. If we play with this, Eber's name, Iver, in Hebrew, is connected to the word for Hebrew. Hebrew in the Hebrew language is Ivrit, and it has the same root of Ever. So Eber's name is connected to the word for Hebrew for the Hebrew people. Peleg's name is connected to the idea of separation or division. And if you play with it, just tolerate this. This is not, a salvation issue. But it is curious that the time to separate the Hebrews from the world took 430 years. Connecting those names and that number of years. It's interesting. Okay. The next 2 references to 430 years occur in the verses we just read just a moment ago about the time that the sons of Israel were in Egypt before the Exodus. And the last reference is from the Apostle Paul, and he records this in Galatians 3:17, saying that the time between the promises to Avram and the giving of the Torah was 430 years. Okay, so those are the 4 places. So maybe in there we have something that we can extract that will mean something to us. And we already looked at Eber and Peleg. Let's take this issue with Paul. And there's a timeline that I put together, and there are various ones that I've now seen on the internet that follow the same thinking. But I put mine at the end of the Drosh notes, so it'll be in the PDF. You can look at it if you like. But bottom line, if we take Paul along with that timeline and the timeline is from the patriarchs through the Exodus, there are several things that are curious. The 430 years, quote, in Egypt, unquote, began counting when Avram first entered Egypt. That would be about 1876 BCE. The time that Yaakov and his sons were actually in Egypt, when he very specifically and his sons, was about 215 years. And the time of slavery, when they were subjected and in hard bondage, was 144 years. Now, it may sound like starting that time clock of 430 years, quote, in Egypt with Avram, starting that clock with Avram, is a bit off. I mean, it sounds like it should start with the sons of Israel, but I think it is actually quite a sound teaching, and it fits with a line of hermeneutics that the author of the book of Hebrews says, and here's a reference in Hebrews 7, 9, and 10. And, so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes. This is speaking about Abraham giving the tithe to Melchizedek. For he, Levi, was still in the loins of his father, Abraham, when Melchizedek met him. Well, actually, Levi was in the loins of Jacob, who was in the loins of Isaac, who was in the loins of Abraham. So we're multiple generations. But in the hermeneutics that the author of Hebrews uses, it connects Levi all the way back through to Abraham and says, when Abraham paid, it's as if Levi paid. So those events that occurred to the patriarchs count as if the descendants were in fact present. This kind of puts some real importance for us to even the idle things that we do, as they then would affect our descendants. So the 430 starting with Avram entering Egypt is maybe not so weird. Maybe it's not so odd. The second thing about 430 I'd like to look at is simply the gematria, and just the very basic gematria of 430. Normally you start with a word and get its value. In this case, we're starting with a number. Remember that gematria takes the numerical value of each letter, and there's a chart up on the screen there. Takes the numerical value of each letter, adds them together, and for that sum, it gives you a number that you can work with. And you can see other words, that all the words that have that same value might, now just might, not always, no guarantees, but they might have a correlation. So it's something for you to look at. So in this case, I start not with any particular word, but with the numerical value of 430. And there are a number of words that pop up. Of those words that have this value, I found a couple that I thought were intriguing for our discussion here. First one, nephesh. It's the animated soul. By definition, and it has the word there, it is a soul, a living being, the life, a self, a person, a desire, a passion, an appetite, or an emotion. It's the animated soul. And what's curious is it is as if the time to bring the soul of the nation, the people of Israel went in with not being a nation, just a family, but the time to bring the soul of that nation to life, because they came out as a nation, was 430 years. And the number for nephesh is 430. It's just interesting. Another one that's even more on the more curious side, the number for Ramesses is 430. If the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Ramesses, then having his name line up with the duration of time is actually kind of curious. Now, it just might be a coincidence, if you believe in coincidences. So, what might we consider, what might we see in this 430? What's special about 4? We might consider that what happens to the patriarchs is as if it is happening to their descendants. Now, while we're not patriarchs, our lives do, in fact, immediately affect our descendants. We might also consider that Adonai plans out events in a very special timeline, and he can put markers at the beginning of the sequence of events that point to the culmination. So for us, we would need to be attentive to what Adonai speaks, even if it may not be easy for us to understand, even if it's hidden from us. We need to be attentive, and we need to be attentive so that we can more easily see his hand as the events play out. So 430, some curiosities, some interesting things that we might want to just think about. The second phrase, to the very day, Vayehi be'etzem hayom hazeh. Why did the Exodus occur on exactly this day? Now, we've opened the idea a little earlier when we talked about 430, that Adonai has specific timelines in accordance with his plans. So, but just how specific are his plans? How firm and well ordered are those plans? And can they be messed up by us or someone else, even by accident? So, how set are these plans? So to talk about the plans a little bit, first, we know from Psalm 139, verses 17 and 18, and there it's up on the screen, that Adonai is a thinker, and that we can never know the fullness of his thoughts. The 139, 17, and 18 is, how precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. It put him to sleep counting it, but it doesn't matter. What's important for the psalmist is that he is with God, but it points out for us that God has so many thoughts you couldn't number them. You couldn't understand the vastness of them. But it tells us he does think. He has thoughts. He has plans. Second thing to note, that rather than being a reactor, something happening and he reacts to it, Adonai is ahead of the game, as it were. He thinks and he plans and he orders events. And that plan is complete and detailed from the beginning. It's not like he fills out the plan as he goes. He's got everything filled out before it happens. And it goes to the extreme that in our life, day by day, each day is recorded before we experience them, before we experience any of them. Again, this is Psalm 139 in verse 16. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. Before he was even conceived, before any day had happened for him, they were all written in the book. That plan was complete, detailed, day by day. It was all there. Unless we think it's just for an individual, it's not. It encompasses entire nations. And speaking about the return of the Babylonian exile, when Israel was to be returned, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, Adonai says, For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Plans for individuals, he knows our day by day. Plans for an entire nation, he has them and he knows the plans. And not just nations and not just individuals, but the exact time of Messiah's incarnation were part of a detailed timeline plan. Paul picks this up in Romans 5:6. You see, at just the right time, there's a plan, and in that time, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Messiah died for the ungodly. Nothing happens in historical events, national events, individual events that Adonai does not already know about and have perfectly thought out plans for. So if we put together the issues of this 430 years and the one we're looking at to the very day, we have the interesting thought that Avram entered Egypt for that first time on Nisan 15. Now, in the events of 430 years later, when the children of Israel were to come out, this time, that time was the beginning of a time of separation, the week of Passover, separating our sustenance from chametz. We are to take and remove chametz from everything that we would eat anywhere, and we are only to eat matzah, not chametz, anywhere. The feeding of our life was not on sinful conduct, but on righteous conduct. That's what the picture was 430 years later. If we scroll back 430 years to when Avram is entering Egypt. So here Avram is entering the land that epitomizes the slavery of sin. That's that picture we get through Passover all the time when we do the Seder and we think about chametz and eating matzah and living rightly. So we ask, can Avram remain separate from the allures of Egypt? He's going into that land at a time when he should be separate, and yet he's going in. Now his descendants, they were removed from the land, so they would not be bound to Egypt. God was separating them from that. How could Avram remain separate when he goes into the land during the week of Passover? If we look at the story in Genesis 12 that records his entry and his time in Egypt, it's really not Avram that does anything. He doesn't keep himself separate. It is Adonai who keeps Avram and Sarai separate, almost in spite of Avram's actions. So, Avram entering the land of Egypt 430 years before the Exodus, but it happens in the same week as Passover, a time of separation. How do we stay separate? How did Avram stay separate? It was God that did that. So, what might we see in this to the very day phrase? Two things. First, we might consider that Adonai has detailed and specific plans for all of history, for the nations, even for individuals, day by day. And these are known before anything has even happened. We might also consider that as we walk out the plans that Adonai has, we may be in difficult places. Places where it seems difficult, if not impossible, to walk uprightly. In those times and places where Adonai's plan is still in force, and it's always in force, but when we're in those places and we know we're in that plan, we can look to Adonai to be our deliverer, knowing it is to his glory to deliver those who trust in him. Okay, the third phrase. Who is it that left Egypt? We think again that it was the sons of Israel, and that's not necessarily a wrong answer, except it may be an incomplete answer. Actually, the verse that we read says that it was Kol Tzevaot Adonai, all the hosts, plural, of Adonai. So we ask, why is it plural? Who are these hosts and why is it plural? So let's take a look at that verse again, just so you believe me that it is. Exodus 12:40 and 41. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, and we've looked at that. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, we've looked at to the very day, all the hosts, plural, of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. And in Hebrew it is plural, it is hosts. So the question is, who are the hosts of Adonai? And I think it's going to be interesting and important for us. So let me pursue that a little bit here. That phrase, the hosts of Adonai in the Hebrew, that phrase occurs 3 times in the Tanakh. It occurs in Exodus 12:41, the one we just read. And then it occurs in Joshua chapter 5 in verses 14, and the translation is a little bit different in 15, although it's the same. Let me read the Joshua passages, and here you can see. He said, now this is the spiritual being, angelic being, whatever, you can decide for yourself. But that person is speaking, not Joshua. No, rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. Interesting there, it's singular, and in Hebrew it's singular. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, What has my Lord to say to his servant? The captain of the Lord's host, again that's the same in Hebrew, they just rearranged it for English, said to Joshua, Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. In these passages in Joshua, our first assumption might be, if we were wondering about this hosts of Adonai, that that host of Adonai was an angelic host. He's coming as the captain of that host, right? But it could be that the captain was only going to assume command over the army of Israel, and that the host then was the army of Israel. And that might seem reasonable. But this encounter happens between Joshua and the captain, happens immediately precedes the conquest of Jericho. And so, if you think about the conquest of Jericho, particularly the walls, we might ask, who, if not angels, caused those walls to fall down? And then in the Hebrew it has tachat, under. The walls didn't just fall over. They fell tachat, they fell under. Now it doesn't say under what. It just says under. But it wasn't that the walls of Jericho were just a rickety wall that fell over. It seems very reasonable that it was an army of angels that pushed those walls down so that the people of Israel could ascend and go into the city. So, did the captain come to supersede Joshua and take over Israel's army? Perhaps. But it's, in my mind, very reasonable, very likely that the captain came with his own army of angels and that they, with Joshua, enacted that conquest of Jericho, with the angels preparing the way by pushing down and pushing the walls under. So, but in the verse we were looking at in Exodus, we are looking at a host that is plural, hosts. And that suggests some multiplicity, like 2 different armies, maybe. So let's take a related phrase, the host of heaven. We find what appears to be situationally 2 different armies. So, in these 2 verses, and there are a bunch of them, I've only picked a few. In these 2 verses, this is Deuteronomy 4:19 and then Jeremiah 8:2. the host seems to be the cosmic entities that we would call stars or planets, or the lights in the sky. So in 4:19 of Deuteronomy, and beware not to lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, host singular, but it's, they've identified it with the sun and the moon and the stars, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. And then in Jeremiah 8:2, they will spread them out, doesn't matter what they're spreading out, to the sun and the moon and all the hosts of heaven. Again, singular, but he connects the sun and the moon and all the hosts of heaven, the stars, which they have loved and which they have served and which they have gone after and which they have sought and which they have worshipped. They will not be gathered or buried. They will be as dung on the face of the ground. All that to say, it seems that the phrase the host of heaven in these two verses speaks specifically to the cosmos, the stars, the lights in the sky at night. But there is another verse, and this is in 1 Kings 2 chapter 22 verse 19. Micaiah says, speaking to Ahab, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven," same Hebrew phrase, host of heaven, "standing by him on his right and on his left." Here the host of heaven is the angelic beings that are part of, if you will, the army of angels that is around the throne. So the phrase host of heaven can be very easily understood as the stars. It can be also very easily understood as this angelic entourage. For full disclosure, there are several verses that could be understood either way. It's not clearly obvious whether he means stars or angels. And maybe he means both in those other verses. Maybe it doesn't matter. But if the host of heaven could be either cosmic entities or angels, then it's reasonable that the host of Adonai, not the host of heaven, but the host of Adonai, could be the human sons of Israel or an angelic army. Could be either one. So we're not sure yet which way it's going. Let's pursue it a little bit further, because the phrase that is used is plural, hosts. The plural, hosts of Adonai, suggests that we have both. That the hosts of Adonai that came out of Egypt was both the sons of Israel and an angelic army. Both the sons of Israel and an angelic army. So that you don't think I'm completely whacked, in Exodus 23 verse 20, it records that there is very specifically identified an angel that will be leading the people. It records, "Behold, I am going to send an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared." Not only is perhaps there an army of angels going with them to guard over them, but very specifically one to lead them. And we also know that they are being led by this column of fire and column of cloud. What the connection between that and the angel is, I'll leave to you. But there is an angel leading them, and perhaps the real possibility that an angelic army left Egypt with the sons of Israel. That possibility then raises another important question. When did that angelic army enter Egypt? If they're leaving with them, they came there at some point. The best timing, in my mind, is that this army entered when Jacob and his entourage entered Egypt. Now, it's very explicit in Jewish tradition that when Jacob left the land of Israel, there were angels that escorted him while he was gone. If that was true, and I don't doubt it, And what we've looked at here suggests the same thing when Jacob left the land again, but this time for Egypt, that an army of angels went with them into the land, and that army is what came out as part of the hosts, plural, of Adonai. So, armies in and armies out. So, what might we see in this phrase, the hosts of Adonai? First, we might consider that Adonai has, according to his eternal plan, prearranged for the protection of his people. Even going into the land of Egypt, the land of slavery, the sons of Israel went with an angelic escort. And second, we might consider that when we are following Adonai's plan, his angelic guard is with us. Now, be careful. I'm not saying that we're not going to face struggles and trials. We still may face struggles and trials just as they did, but we will not be overcome. The people of Israel, the sons of Israel in the land of Egypt, even oppressed, flourished and prospered and grew mighty. They were not overcome. Was it because of this army of angels? It's interesting. Something to think about. So in conclusion, here again is our verse, just to get us grounded back to starting point. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So we were wondering at the beginning about the uncertainty of our times. Was anybody minding the store, so to speak? What we found in this verse was that in fact Adonai has very detailed plans, and that those plans cover historical events like the incarnation of Messiah, national events, and individual lives. That those plans are timelined, that there are times when specific things will happen, and events happen just as they are supposed to, at the exact right time, to the very day, at the right time Messiah came. And we found that Adonai escorts his people by an angelic host to keep them from being overwhelmed. They were not there alone, but an angelic host was there with them and came out with them. We can be comforted and encouraged that Adonai is minding the store, even the store of our lives. And we can walk in faith, trusting in him. Shabbat Shalom.